What happens when a black man, undercover as a passenger, is wrongfully accused of theft, only to reveal he's the new CEO of the airline? Raymond Jones's story is one of resilience, courage, and the fight for change in the face of bias. From false accusations to spearheading a cultural transformation, his journey proves the power of leadership and integrity. Watch until the end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know your thoughts on this powerful story.
Recognizes who he really is. Raymond, an ambitious executive, had been working for years at various airlines, climbing the ranks quietly while dealing with murmurs and doubts about his potential. Whenever he walked into a meeting, he was often asked if he'd been lost or if he was someone's assistant. He learned how to mask his frustration behind a friendly smile. He had no desire to start arguments but believed in proving himself through consistent excellence. On the day he was offered the CEO position at Airline, he carried that news with both pride and dread, uncertain what reactions he might face in an organization that had historically struggled with racial bias. His first trip to the central hub of Air's headquarters was supposed to be an inconspicuous one. He'd been told to keep his arrival low-key, to move among the staff without their knowledge. The board wanted to see how their employees naturally behaved toward the customers of diverse backgrounds. So, Raymond arrived at the bustling airport wearing a simple collared shirt and slacks. He clutched a carry-on bag, a worn, brown leather piece that had accompanied him on countless flights. He walked through the terminal, quietly observing ticket agents assisting travelers, security guards checking luggage, and flight attendants chatting with passengers. Undercover was how he liked it. No fanfare, no stares, just an authentic snapshot of how the airline treated ordinary people. It all started in the check-in line. Raymond saw a family with 2 toddlers struggling to keep calm, while the parents fidgeted with multiple boarding passes. A young agent with short blonde hair tried to soothe the crying children with playful banter. At the same time, Raymond noticed an older gentleman who appeared to be in a hurry at the next counter. The older gentleman was raising his voice, complaining about baggage fees. A second agent handled the confrontation with practiced politeness, her voice unwavering even as the older man became visibly frustrated. Raymond watched, impressed with their patience. He listened to how the agents treated all sorts of people, from business travelers to the elderly. As he inched forward, he overheard an agent say, "I'm sorry, sir, that's our policy," at least 4 times, carefully trying to maintain respect. People were used to complaining about airline fees and delays, so nothing seemed amiss. After getting his boarding pass, Raymond headed toward security. In the queue, he noticed some folks staring at him, not with overt hostility, but with mild curiosity. Perhaps they assumed he was one of many random travelers. He smiled faintly and placed his shoes and bag onto the conveyor belt. The security officer ushered him through the metal detector, scanning him with that impartial glance they give everyone. In a matter of minutes, he was gathering his things, relieved that the process had been standard. No fuss, no special inquiries, no suspicious glances, or so he thought. On the way to his gate, Raymond stopped by a small cafe. He had almost an hour before boarding, so he bought a cup of coffee. As he took that first sip, he heard a sudden commotion behind him. A tall man with a sharp, stern face and an Airline uniform was gesturing wildly at a woman carrying a baby. "Ma'am, you can't bring that oversized carry-on," he barked. The mother tried explaining that the bag contained items for her child, but the man persisted, pointing her toward the check-in desk. Nearby passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. Raymond decided not to intervene, but he mentally noted the employee's name. Duncan. Duncan had a way of speaking that sounded more like giving orders than offering assistance, as though he took pleasure in exercising his authority. Raymond sipped his coffee in silence until an announcement came over the speakers for boarding. He wondered if he'd be on the same flight as that mother, worried she might have trouble finding overhead storage. Collecting his bag, he hurried toward gate C12, where an Orion Air sign glowed in bold letters. The waiting area was crowded, a tangle of travelers in varying moods. Some tapped away on laptops. Others quietly read. A few dozed in uncomfortable chairs, and occasionally a child would pipe up with questions about airplanes. Raymond scanned the staff near the gate, noticing a slender man with a name tag that said Sebastian, who was scanning tickets. As Raymond settled into a seat, he glanced at his phone. He had received a message from the Orion Air Board secretary. "We will meet you tomorrow at the headquarters after your flight arrives. Remember not to reveal your identity prematurely." Raymond was anxious. He was the first black CEO in the history of the airline, and while he was excited, he was also prepared for resistance. Part of him considered how employees, like the stern staffer named Duncan, might react. A woman with curly black hair and warm brown eyes sat beside him, adjusting her jacket. She introduced herself as Anita, traveling for a work conference. She seemed friendly, asking if this was also his flight to Redwood City. He nodded, and soon they were chatting about airline traveling pains, baggage constraints, and how seats felt cramped these days. They laughed, sharing anecdotes about crying babies on flights. For a moment, Raymond felt relieved to have a casual conversation. Anita had no idea who he was, nor did she care. She was simply making small talk with a fellow passenger, and for Raymond, that felt refreshing. When boarding began, the staff announced first-class passengers, then families with small children, then group numbers. Raymond's seat was in business class under a ticket purchased by the airline's board. He carried it as discreetly as possible, not wanting to attract attention. As he made his way down the jet bridge, he saw the mother from earlier struggling to juggle her baby and carry-on. She looked flustered, and he stepped in to hold the bag for a moment so she could pass through. She thanked him repeatedly, relief evident in her eyes. Inside the plane, the mood shifted. Flight attendants greeted passengers with varying degrees of cheeriness, though some of them seemed more perfunctory in their welcomes. The overhead bins were filling up quickly. As he took his seat in a row of wide leather chairs, Raymond noticed that the mother ended up passing by him to reach her seat in coach. She had found a place for her bag but seemed stressed. He made a mental note to ensure that if any assistance was needed, he would offer a hand. He'd learned from experience how small acts of kindness could make or break someone's travel day. Just as the flight attendants were preparing the doors, Duncan, the stern staff member from before, stepped on board, conferring with a colleague. He scanned the cabin, briefly making eye contact with Raymond. Then he continued walking down the aisle, occasionally pausing to tell someone to stow their carry-on properly. Raymond noticed how his tone softened when addressing certain passengers and hardened when speaking to others. There was a subtlety in the shift that Raymond found concerning. Still, he waited, trying not to jump to conclusions, though he suspected it was related to biases that staff training might not have eradicated. Moments later, the flight attendants closed the overhead bins. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they'd be taking off shortly, apologizing in advance if there were any delays due to weather conditions. The plane taxied out, gaining speed on the runway until it lifted into the sky. Raymond felt that familiar rush of excitement and a sense of responsibility. When they landed in Redwood City, he'd officially step into the role of CEO, though he planned to keep it quiet until the next day. This was the start of a new chapter, and he had every intention of changing how Orion Air interacted with customers of every background. Halfway through the flight, an attendant offered beverages. Raymond politely asked for water. The flight attendant smiled, poured him a glass, and moved on. He thought the flight was proceeding smoothly until he heard a man's voice across the aisle raising an accusation. "Hey, did you take my laptop bag?" Startled, Raymond looked over. A red-faced man wearing an expensive-looking suit and sitting one row behind him was complaining that his laptop bag was missing from the overhead bin. The man's eyes darted around, scanning the cabin as though searching for a culprit. A flight attendant approached to mediate. The man insisted he'd put his laptop bag overhead before takeoff, but now it was nowhere to be found. The attendant calmly asked for a description. The man described it as a black leather laptop bag with a silver zipper, stating it was quite expensive. Another passenger mentioned seeing someone rearranging carry-ons earlier. The entire atmosphere grew tense as travelers craned their necks, trying to see what was happening. Duncan, who was now assisting the cabin crew, hurried over. He quickly looked around and his gaze settled on Raymond's carry-on, which was brown leather, clearly not matching the missing bag's description. Nonetheless, Duncan stepped close to Raymond and spoke in a sharp tone. "Sir, can I check your belongings?" Raymond was stunned. So was Anita, who sat a few rows behind him. Immediately, people looked on, eyebrows raised. Duncan's request seemed oddly directed, as if he had singled Raymond out. Raymond, wanting to cooperate, calmly replied, "My bag is right here. Feel free to look, but it's not the black bag." He watched as Duncan rifled through his carry-on without so much as a polite introduction. The rummaging felt invasive, especially when done under suspicious eyes. Some passengers looked embarrassed to witness it. Others stared, forming silent judgments. Upon finding no laptop in Raymond's bag, Duncan moved on. The red-faced man grew impatient, muttering something about people lying and dishonesty. The flight attendant tried to calm him. Then, a passenger from across the aisle realized they had shifted some items around to fit their coat, and in the process the black bag might have been moved to another overhead bin in a different row. Everyone began searching the bins until, finally, the bag was discovered 3 rows back, completely intact. The man rushed over, grabbed his bag, and mumbled an apology that felt half-hearted at best. He glared in Raymond's direction, as if grudgingly acknowledging a mistake. Duncan said nothing to apologize. Instead, he simply returned to the front of the cabin, leaving Raymond to feel the sting of unjust suspicion. After that tense moment, Raymond felt the eyes of some passengers flick toward him, even if briefly. He wondered how many times similar incidents went unaddressed. He reminded himself to remain calm. Soon, they'd all discover who he really was. The flight continued in relative silence. Raymond opened a newspaper, trying to distract himself. He couldn't help replaying the incident in his mind, thinking about how quickly suspicion had fallen on him. His heart pounded, but outwardly he remained composed. When they landed, the usual scramble of passengers began, everyone collecting their bags, hurrying to deplane. Raymond waited patiently, letting those behind him go first. He stood, smoothed out his shirt, and lifted his carry-on from the overhead bin. Anita caught his eye, giving him a sympathetic look. She quietly said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. That was unfair." Raymond thanked her, and they parted ways, both uncertain if they'd ever see each other again. Stepping onto the jet bridge, Raymond noticed how the crowd dispersed, some rushing to connecting flights, some heading for baggage claim. He paused in the arrivals hall, scanning for a driver who was supposed to meet him. However, no one held a sign with his name. He realized he'd arrived earlier than scheduled, thanks to favorable tailwinds. Instead of waiting around, he decided to navigate to the rideshare pickup area. Along the way, he spotted Duncan at a nearby kiosk, talking animatedly with another airline employee. Their eyes briefly met, but Duncan quickly turned away. Raymond pondered whether he should introduce himself right then and there. But the board had made it clear. Keep your identity a secret until the official meeting. He sighed and continued walking, aware that a confrontation in the middle of the airport wouldn't be beneficial. He didn't want a scene. He wanted to understand the culture of the airline from the ground up. Once outside, the crisp air hit him, and he dialed a rideshare service, placing his bag at his feet. The city skyline loomed in the distance. Redwood City was new to him, and the promise of heading Orion Air from its corporate headquarters was both thrilling and daunting. The rideshare car pulled up, the driver helped load his luggage, and off they went through busy streets lined with restaurants and office buildings. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the skyscrapers, making them shimmer. On the drive, Raymond thought about possible strategies to address the biases in the airline staff, especially after what he had just experienced. He wanted to reshape the entire operation, from hiring practices to customer interaction training. He also carried a sense of caution, knowing that power shifts often unsettle people resistant to change. He arrived at the hotel where the company had booked his suite. The staff greeted him with smiles, handing him a room key. There was a gift basket from the board members waiting in his suite, filled with corporate-branded goodies. Inside the basket, a note read, "Welcome to Redwood City, Mr. Jones. We look forward to tomorrow's meeting. The board." Raymond sank into the plush armchair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A wave of exhaustion washed over him as he contemplated the day's events. The accusation on the plane weighed heavily on his mind, reaffirming the work that lay ahead. The next morning, Raymond dressed in a tailored suit that his mentor, a previous airline CEO, had once recommended. He wanted to look the part, but more importantly, he wanted to step into the office with a sense of quiet confidence. Upon reaching the Orion Air headquarters, a sleek glass building near the downtown district, he marveled at the grandeur. The lobby boasted an enormous model of one of their passenger jets, suspended from the ceiling. Employees hustled back and forth with coffee cups and laptops, giving the place a distinct corporate hum. He walked up to the reception desk, introduced himself under his real name and role, and watched the receptionist's eyes widen in surprise. She stammered out, "Good morning, Mr. Jones. Welcome to Orion Air. The board is expecting you in the conference room on the top floor." Riding the elevator, Raymond gathered his thoughts. The doors opened onto an elegant corridor lined with framed historical photos of Orion Air's early days. At the end of the hall stood the executive conference room, its glass walls giving a panoramic view of the city. As Raymond stepped inside, a group of sharply dressed board members stood to greet him. Handshakes, polite smiles, and a few genuine grins of pride met him. One of them, a woman in a navy suit, introduced herself as Chairperson Caroline Lee. She seemed relieved to see him, as if uncertain he would arrive without incident. They settled around a massive table, going over formalities. Raymond signed documents affirming his role, and official photos were taken. He was now CEO of Orion Air. It was a ceremonial moment, but he couldn't shake the memory of being searched on the flight. After the formalities, the conversation turned practical. They discussed existing problems: delayed flights, complaints about baggage fees, lack of diversity in senior management, and mounting customer dissatisfaction regarding how certain employees treated passengers. Raymond listened intently, took notes, and nodded. He could almost predict the steps needed to address each issue. Then Caroline asked, "Will you be taking a tour of the facility, meeting department heads?" Raymond answered that he intended to do so immediately. He wanted to meet everyone face to face, starting from the operations department to the ground crew. The group exchanged excited glances. They seemed eager for new leadership. The board members eventually dispersed, leaving Raymond alone for a moment in the conference room. He looked out at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. This was his domain now, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders. As he began his tour, he visited the HR department, marketing, and route planning. He noticed a distinct lack of diversity in the managerial ranks, though there were employees from various backgrounds in lower-level positions. When HR staff realized who he was, they became fidgety, rushing to put on their best image. He asked them about employee training, specifically around bias. The head of HR, a middle-aged man named Patrick, admitted they ran annual diversity workshops, but acknowledged the feedback had been lukewarm. Raymond silently noted that these workshops likely weren't making much of an impact. When he arrived at the operations floor, he saw a flurry of activity: flight schedules projected on large screens, staff answering phones, rebooking passengers when necessary. The manager was a woman named Salma, who greeted Raymond with a warm smile. She spoke enthusiastically about her team, but her face clouded when he asked if she'd observed any issues with discrimination among staff. She hesitated, her eyes darting around. "Well, I've heard complaints. Nothing formal, but sometimes employees treat certain passengers differently," she said. "It's tough to prove, and no one wants to be labeled a troublemaker." Raymond understood. It was the same type of reluctance he'd encountered for years in this industry. Later in the day, Raymond insisted on taking a quick walk through the airport's main concourse with Caroline to see day-to-day operations in action. They walked by check-in counters and baggage claims, observing as staff navigated the steady stream of travelers. He spotted Duncan at one of the gates, his posture stiff, voice curt. Caroline noticed Raymond's gaze. "That's Duncan Smith. He's a senior gate agent," she explained. "Been here quite a while. We get the occasional complaint about his demeanor, but he's good at keeping flights on time." Raymond only nodded, not wanting to reveal that he had already encountered Duncan in a very unpleasant manner. A short while later, they returned to the office. Caroline parted ways for another meeting, leaving Raymond to roam alone. He decided to stop by the staff lounge, a spacious area where employees took breaks. To his surprise, he saw Anita there, wearing a company badge. She was leaning over the coffee machine, trying to coax out the last few drops. She recognized him instantly, nearly dropping her cup. "You're the new CEO?" she whispered, shocked. He nodded, smiling. He'd had no idea she worked for Orion Air. She explained that she was in the sales department and had been traveling to meet clients. Raymond recalled how kind she'd been on the plane, quickly addressing the awkwardness. "I appreciated your support during that incident," he said. Anita shook her head. "It was horrible. I hate seeing a colleague behave that way." She paused, then added, "I'm so glad you're here. This company needs fresh leadership." Raymond realized Anita might be a valuable ally, someone who understood the problems from both a passenger's and employee's perspective. She suggested they talk more sometime, maybe over lunch, to discuss what employees really needed. Raymond agreed enthusiastically. Over the following days, word spread that Raymond was not just a new executive, but the CEO himself. Some employees scrambled to show their best side. Others bristled, worried about changes to come. Reports of bias and employee misconduct surfaced as staff felt more confident in sharing their experiences. Raymond read through every email that came in, determined to address each issue. He also discovered older complaints that had been swept under the rug. One such complaint involved Duncan. A previous passenger had reported him for targeting them unfairly, but it was dismissed as a misunderstanding. Raymond felt a sense of urgency. He wanted to speak to Duncan personally, but not in a way that would create public drama. So he arranged a private meeting in his office. Duncan arrived, looking nervous but trying to maintain a defiant stance. He sat across from Raymond, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Raymond began calmly. "I want to talk to you about how we treat passengers at Orion Air. Customer service is crucial, and I've observed a pattern in your approach." Duncan stiffened. "I do my job. I keep flights on time, enforce rules. "If that offends some people, I can't help it," he said, his tone clipped. Raymond stared at him, remembering how it felt to have Duncan rummage through his bag. He continued, "I'm sure you understand that fairness and respect are part of doing your job. I've had complaints, and I also have first-hand experience. You inspected my bag on that flight from Carson City. Do you remember?" Duncan blinked in confusion, probably wondering how an ordinary passenger could have risen to the position of CEO overnight. I was just following protocol," he managed to say. Raymond found it difficult not to reveal the anger he felt, but he remained poised. The passenger who lost his bag described a black laptop bag, but mine was brown, so it seems there wasn't any rationale besides suspicion. Duncan said nothing for a moment, jaw tightening. He glanced at the door as if planning an escape. "Look, if you want me to treat everyone with kid gloves, I can't do my job. Sometimes we have to be firm." Raymond nodded. "I understand firmness, but this pattern goes beyond being strict about airline policies. If it doesn't change, we'll have to take further action." After Duncan left, Raymond felt the weight of all the potential conflicts that lay ahead. That conversation was just the first in what he suspected would be a series of difficult interactions. He refused to tolerate behavior that undermined the trust and dignity of passengers, especially if it stemmed from racial bias. But changing the culture would require more than just top-down directives. He needed a coalition of employees who believed in a new vision. He reached out to Anita, and together they brainstormed a strategy that would transform their airline from within. They formed a small internal group dedicated to improving the customer experience and rooting out bias. It included a mix of HR representatives, veteran employees who had a record of fair treatment, and members from different departments. During their initial meetings, they all shared stories. Some were heartbreaking accounts of racial prejudice by certain staff members, while others were uplifting anecdotes about employees who went above and beyond to help passengers in need. Each story deepened Raymond's resolve. However, tension brewed among the ranks. Some employees whispered that Raymond was too sensitive, that he was making a mountain out of a molehill. They believed he was out to punish hard-working people over minor misunderstandings. Subtle pushback began, with some department heads dragging their feet on implementing new training modules or ignoring memos about improved customer relations. Raymond sensed the undercurrent of resistance growing stronger each day. An ominous rumor circulated. Senior staff might appeal to the board to reconsider Raymond's leadership if they felt he was too radical. He doubted the board would turn on him so soon, given the airline's precarious public image. But he also knew old habits died hard, and corporate politics could be ruthless. Meanwhile, Duncan, who was a longtime employee, seemed to be stoking the fire. There was chatter in the break rooms about how the new CEO has a chip on his shoulder. Duncan's allies rallied around him, claiming his tough approach kept flights efficient. Amid this turbulence, Raymond found an unexpected ally in Salma from operations. She had influence with the staff because she was known to be fair, and her department was critical to daily flight schedules. One evening after hours, Raymond met with her in the nearly deserted office. She told him, "I've seen too many talented employees from diverse backgrounds leave because they felt unwelcome. If you're serious about changing that, I'll back you up. I can help by implementing new protocols and operations so we lead by example." Raymond thanked her, knowing her support could be pivotal. He also discovered that the mother from that flight, the one Duncan had berated for having an oversized carry-on, had filed a complaint. HR had ignored it until now. Raymond made sure the case was reopened. It was a small but significant step in sending the message that every complaint would be taken seriously no matter how trivial it appeared. He read her statement, which described her embarrassment and stress. She specifically mentioned that no one else seemed to have their carry-on questioned. even though some of them were just as large. Raymond directed HR to contact her personally, apologize on behalf of the airline, and offer compensation for her trouble. It was the least they could do. That gesture gained public attention when the grateful mother posted about it on social media, praising the new CEO for swift action. While the post garnered positive comments, it also attracted trolls who claimed she was just playing the victim. Raymond saw the comments, some of which were downright racist. It hurt, but it confirmed his conviction that the airline needed systematic change. The board noticed the positive wave of publicity, congratulating Raymond for turning what could have been a damaging PR incident into something constructive. They encouraged him to keep up the momentum, but not everyone felt the same. While Ray's popularity grew outside the company, inside, there were pockets of resistance. Rumors surfaced that he was trying to push certain older employees out. Some called him a figurehead, installed to make the airline appear progressive while not really understanding the business. The tension escalated when, during a busy afternoon, an incident took place in the main concourse. A middle-aged black passenger named Terrence was pulled aside by security after being accused by a coworker of suspicious behavior. Terrence was about to miss his flight and broke down in tears, claiming he'd done nothing wrong. Raymond was informed by a distressed staffer in real time and rushed to see what was happening. He arrived to find Terrence being questioned aggressively by a security officer, while a frantic gate agent insisted Terrence looked like someone who had caused trouble earlier. Another agent who knew Terrence personally from frequent flights tried to intervene, but the officer dismissed her pleas. Raymond observed how closely this mirrored his own experience on the plane. He approached calmly, identified himself, and asked for an explanation. After some awkward hesitation, the security officer admitted there was no concrete evidence beyond a vague resemblance to a disruptive passenger from the previous day. Raymond apologized to Terrence right there, in front of onlookers. He assured him that Orion Air would reschedule his flight and upgrade him. Terrence, shaken but relieved, thanked Raymond for stepping in. The gate agent who had insisted on calling security shifted uncomfortably, aware of how bad the situation looked. Duncan was also present, apparently training a new employee at a nearby gate, and he watched the entire exchange with a stony face. After Terrence left, Raymond called the security officer and the gate agent into a private corner of the concourse. "Our policies require us to have probable cause before detaining passengers. We do not rely on gut feelings that might be influenced by unconscious bias." His voice was firm but measured. They nodded, looking down, and mumbled apologies. Duncan lingered on the outskirts, arms folded, listening. Raymond made eye contact with him, silently conveying that he would not tolerate any more humiliating incidents. That night, Raymond returned to his hotel feeling mentally exhausted. He scrolled through emails from employees detailing stories of racial tension, class bias, and nepotism. It reminded him of the complexity of the task. He noticed an email from Anita, who had been gathering informal feedback from her colleagues in sales and ticketing. One story she shared detailed how certain staffers would routinely check the passports of passengers of color far more often than others for domestic flights, even though it wasn't necessary. Another story recounted how a brilliant intern from a historically black college felt undervalued and left to join a competitor. These anecdotes fired up Raymond. He typed back, "Thank you for your diligence. Let's set up a meeting to discuss next steps." But as he leaned back in his chair, the phone rang. It was the board's chairperson, Caroline. Her voice sounded urgent. "There's going to be a meeting tomorrow morning with some senior staff members who are concerned about your recent directives. They want to discuss how your push for accountability is affecting morale." Raymond recognized the subtext. A faction was forming to oppose him. The old guard likely felt threatened. He inhaled slowly and answered, "Understood. I'll be ready." The following morning, tension hung in the air. Raymond walked into the executive conference room, where a cluster of department heads and board members awaited him. He noted who was present: finance, legal, marketing, operations, and a few others. Duncan was not high-ranking enough to be there, but some of his allies were. Caroline opened the meeting, announcing that they were there to address concerns about the new leadership approach. A man named Bradley from finance spoke first, clearing his throat. "We appreciate your dedication, but we've had complaints of staff feeling micromanaged, worried they'll be fired for innocent mistakes. They say the environment has become tense." Several heads nodded in agreement, while others remained still, clearly ambivalent. Raymond replied, "I welcome feedback, but we must differentiate between genuine mistakes and patterns of discrimination that damage our reputation. My directives aim to protect both employees and customers." Murmurs spread across the table. An older woman from legal, Miss Whitman, chimed in, "We do not dispute the importance of fairness, but rapid changes can cause pushback. We want to ensure you proceed cautiously. Unions might get involved if employees claim they're being punished unfairly." Raymond countered, "Punished for what? We have documented evidence of bias incidents. We're not punishing people for accidents, we're addressing a widespread issue that's harming the airline's brand." A voice from marketing, Candace, spoke up. "Actually, the public has responded positively. We saw an uptick in favorable mentions online after the mother posted about how the company rectified her complaint. But internal morale is key. We can't move forward if half the staff is disgruntled." Silence fell again. Each side's perspective laid bare. Caroline sighed, recognizing the stalemate. Finally, she turned to Raymond. "Let's give employees space to adapt. We need structured training programs, clear guidelines, and a transparent reporting mechanism. Will you agree to slow the pace so they don't feel ambushed?" Raymond considered this carefully. He needed allies, not mutiny. "I can agree to setting up a phased implementation plan with deadlines, so no one feels blindsided," he said. Bradley from finance interjected, "And there should be a process for staff to appeal if they feel they were wrongly accused of bias." Raymond nodded. "Yes, that's fair. We want a just system for everyone." With the major bones of contention addressed, the meeting ended on a tenuous note of agreement. However, Raymond sensed unresolved tension. He knew some key staff members remained unconvinced. As the group dispersed, Salma discreetly approached him. "I'm glad you stood your ground but made concessions. Some of these people have been here for decades, and they can influence hundreds of employees." Raymond thanked her for the support, reminding himself that compromise was sometimes necessary to move forward. Over the next couple of weeks, Orion Air announced a new, mandatory training program focusing on customer service and unconscious bias. The airline hired external consultants to teach sessions. Raymond, wanting to lead by example, attended the first workshop alongside other employees, from gate agents to executives. The training included role-playing scenarios. Some employees grumbled, rolling their eyes, while others took notes, engaged in discussion. The consultants explained how biases could form unconsciously and offered tools to overcome them. Raymond contributed real-life anecdotes from his experiences. He didn't single out names, but staff could easily guess who he meant. Duncan showed up to one of these sessions with a visibly disinterested expression, arms crossed. During a break, he stepped outside, pacing near the vending machine. Raymond decided to approach him, hoping to find some common ground. "How do you feel about the training?" he asked gently. Duncan shrugged. "I think it's a waste of time. We know how to do our jobs." Raymond breathed in, trying to stay calm. This isn't about job competency, it's about understanding how unconscious attitudes can harm customers and the airline's reputation. Duncan narrowed his eyes. So you're calling me racist now? Raymond shook his head. I'm pointing out that certain behaviors, regardless of intention, can be interpreted as discrimination. We need to be mindful. I've been on the receiving end myself. Duncan scoffed, shoving his hands into his pockets. You were a passenger, and I was doing my job. The guy lost his laptop bag. How was I supposed to know your bag was brown? Raymond paused, choosing his words carefully. That's precisely why this training is important. It helps us slow down and ask the right questions before jumping to conclusions. With that, Raymond walked back into the training room, leaving Duncan to mull over what he had said. Meanwhile, Anita circulated an anonymous survey, requesting honest feedback from employees about workplace culture. She gathered hundreds of responses. Patterns emerged. Many employees claimed they'd witnessed or experienced subtle discrimination by certain staff members who were never disciplined. Some felt promotions were given to an in crowd, generally those who looked and acted a certain way. Raymond convened a meeting with HR and Salma to discuss the findings. They realized that tackling these issues would require complete restructuring of recruitment, mentorship programs, and performance evaluations. It was a mammoth task but necessary to create lasting change. Soon after, the airline planned an all-hands meeting to unveil a new code of conduct. As CEO, Raymond stood on a stage in an auditorium filled with employees. A live stream broadcasted his speech to staff in offices and airports across the country. He addressed them, acknowledging the airline's past shortcomings and pledging to shape a more equitable future. He emphasized that focusing on fair treatment wasn't just a moral imperative, but also good for business. When passengers trust us, they come back. When employees feel valued, they stay. We thrive together, he said, passion igniting his voice. The applause was polite, though not thunderous. He read mixed expressions in the audience. Some staff members seemed genuinely inspired while others looked skeptical, arms folded in silent protest. He knew the real measure of success would be in actions, not words, and that could take months or even years. But he refused to be discouraged. Behind the scenes, trouble brewed. At the next leadership meeting, Bradley from finance reported that employee turnover had spiked since Raymond's appointment. People say they feel under scrutiny, he said with a pointed glance. Raymond frowned. We can't ignore that some people might be leaving because they don't agree with our new direction. But if we lose employees who refuse to treat passengers with respect, is that truly a loss for the airline? The room quieted. Caroline cleared her throat. We must be strategic. Training and transparency are vital, but let's ensure we don't create a climate of fear. As the meeting ended, rumors swirled that a group of senior employees were petitioning the board to review Raymond's decisions. Caroline privately reassured him that the board, for now, supported his leadership. She also warned him that alliances in corporate politics can shift quickly, and he should remain vigilant. Amid the turmoil, good things were happening. Passengers started noticing improvements in the way they were treated. The mother from the flight who had posted on social media remained vocal about her positive experiences since then. Terrence, the passenger wrongfully detained, sent a grateful note after receiving a personal apology and a travel voucher. A steady trickle of positive reviews surfaced on traveler forums, praising Orion Air's staff for new levels of courtesy and attentiveness. Raymond took these signs of progress as encouragement. An unexpected twist came when Anita discovered a scandal involving accounting irregularities in the budgeting for certain flight routes. Concerned, she brought the documents to Raymond, who decided to investigate further. It turned out that a few high-level employees, likely part of the old guard, or mismanaging funds, possibly even funneling money to side projects. This threatened the airline's financial stability. Raymond realized that to truly transform Orion Air, he'd also have to root out corruption. It wasn't just about racial bias. It was about integrity at every level. He called a confidential meeting with Caroline and the legal department to discuss the evidence Anita had found. Caroline was livid, saying, "We can't let corruption ruin the airline. If there's proof, we need to act quickly, but discreetly." The legal team agreed to launch an internal audit and interview those involved. This step inflamed tensions even further, especially when certain managers were asked to cooperate. Whispers spread that Raymond was on a witch hunt. He began receiving cold stares in the hallways, and some employees even avoided making eye contact with him. Despite the friction, a sense of justice rallied around Raymond's cause. Younger employees saw him as a champion of ethics and progress. They formed a supportive network, openly discussing the airline's future and how they could help. Salma rallied the operations team, ensuring that daily schedules ran smoothly. She believed that if they maintained operational excellence, it would be harder for critics to blame Raymond for disruptions. Anita kept collecting feedback and passing it on, refining new policies. HR finally committed to restructuring promotions and evaluations, giving all employees a fair shot at advancement. The tension reached a breaking point when an investigative journalist got wind of the corruption probe. The reporter requested an interview with Raymond, promising to shine a light on the airline's internal battles. The board advised caution, worried about negative press. Raymond, however, felt transparency was crucial to gain public trust. He agreed to a carefully arranged interview. During the interview, he spoke candidly about his experiences with bias in the industry, his vision for Orion Air, and his refusal to ignore wrongdoing. The journalist pressed him on whether this was a crusade or a genuine attempt at organizational reform. Raymond answered, "I believe a company that values integrity and equality is a stronger company. My goal is to ensure Orion Air thrives for everyone, passengers, employees, and shareholders alike." The article that followed was a mix of praise and scrutiny. It commended Raymond's courage but also questioned whether he could survive the backlash. Opponents within the airline felt exposed, and tensions escalated. After the story published, hateful messages began flooding Raymond's inbox, accusing him of dividing the staff and threatening lawsuits. He expected such resistance. Change rarely comes without a fight. By the time the internal audit concluded, enough evidence had surfaced to implicate several senior employees in financial misconduct. The board convened a special meeting to determine disciplinary actions. They voted to terminate those involved, citing a breach of ethical standards. Some employees cheered the decision, seeing it as proof that the airline was serious about reform. Others grumbled about losing experienced veterans. Duncan, whose name wasn't on the list but who was close to some of the implicated individuals, grew more hostile. He refused to speak to Anita or Salma, who he believed were part of the reason Orion Air was turning into a circus of political correctness and witch hunts. Raymond knew the next big challenge would be addressing how employees like Duncan could adapt or eventually move on. One afternoon, he ran into Duncan by chance in the staff lounge. The tension was palpable as soon as they made eye contact. Duncan spoke first. "So, you got rid of my friends. Congratulations." Raymond exhaled. "I didn't remove anyone who hadn't broken the rules. The audit revealed serious financial misconduct." Duncan glared. "You could have handled it differently, given them a chance to fix mistakes. Instead, you made an example out of them." Raymond met his stare, determined not to back down. "They made a choice to break the law. I'm here to ensure the company upholds integrity." Duncan shook his head. Anger etched on his face, then pushed past Raymond to exit the lounge. That night, Orion Air's official social media platforms buzzed with debate. Some employees posted supportive messages about the new CEO. Others hinted at dissatisfaction without naming him directly. Meanwhile, customers engaged, sharing stories of improved experiences at Orion Air. The public tension had an unintended side effect. More people became curious about the airline's transformation, and ticket sales rose. Revenue improved, and analysts noted the airline's brand was trending upward. The board, seeing these positive financial indicators, doubled down on their support for Raymond, leaving the dissenting employees with fewer arguments. Shortly thereafter, an opportunity arose for Orion Air to host an international aviation conference. Major industry players would attend, discussing trends and forging partnerships. It was a chance for Orion Air to showcase its new direction. Raymond insisted on a keynote address about the importance of diversity and ethical leadership in aviation. Some executives worried it might shine too bright a light on the airline's internal struggles. However, Raymond argued that honesty and transparency were the airline's new pillars. On the day of the conference, Raymond took the stage before a global audience of airline CEOs, analysts, and journalists. He spoke about Orion Air's journey, without delving into private details, emphasizing the necessity of rooting out bias and corruption for a sustainable future. His speech was met with a standing ovation by many, though some onlookers remained skeptical. He afterward networked with other CEOs, garnering expressions of interest from those who realized the travel industry was evolving, and customers demanded fair treatment. That evening, while scanning social media for reactions, Raymond stumbled upon a live stream from an airline staffer. It showed Duncan leading a small protest of employees outside the terminal, holding signs reading "Respect Veteran Employees" and "CEO equals Witch Hunter." The group was small, only about 15 people, but it made for a dramatic sight. Raymond suspected it was more about personal grudges than any legitimate issue. The next morning, the local news ran a short segment on the protest, painting it as internal strife at Orion Air. Caroline called him, voice tense, "The board is concerned about these optics. We trust you, but you need to address this protest. We can't let a small faction define our public image." Raymond agreed. He asked Salma and Anita for suggestions. Anita recommended a town hall meeting where employees could voice concerns directly. If people feel heard, maybe the tension will simmer down, she reasoned. Salma offered to moderate the discussion. So, a town hall was scheduled in the corporate auditorium. Hundreds of employees attended, including Duncan and the protesters, still wearing their scowls. Raymond began by acknowledging that the changes were sudden and that it's natural for people to fear losing what they're accustomed to. He opened the floor to questions. A few employees voiced worry about job security, while others praised the new direction. Duncan eventually took the mic, calling the recent firings an overreach and accusing Raymond of playing the race card. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Raymond squared his shoulders, responding calmly. When people break ethical guidelines, it has nothing to do with race. They face consequences. As for me playing the race card, I've been focused on fairness for everyone. If that feels threatening, perhaps you need to ask yourself why. The tension soared, but many employees applauded, supporting Raymond's stance. Duncan glowered, then handed the microphone back, apparently at a loss for a counter-argument. In the aftermath of that tense moment, employees slowly began to talk more openly. People shared experiences they'd kept hidden, validating the necessity for the airline's transformation. Not everyone left the town hall satisfied, but it marked a turning point. The protest group diminished in size and noise, and a clearer sense of direction emerged. Over the subsequent months, Orion Air's new training programs became standard practice. Customer satisfaction scores rose. The airline's PR campaigns highlighted stories of employees who had gone above and beyond to help travelers in emergencies or difficult situations. Even some skeptics admitted that morale felt better once they realized these changes weren't a passing fad, but a genuine shift in culture. Duncan, however, remained a stubborn figure, frequently clashing with colleagues and supervisors. When another complaint surfaced about him confronting a passenger rudely, the HR department followed the new guidelines, placing him on probation. One afternoon, he marched into Raymond's office unannounced, looking defeated. "I've been here for 20 years, he said. "I don't know how to do this job any other way. Maybe it's time for me to go." Raymond studied him for a long moment. "I don't want you to leave if you're willing to grow. You can be strict and uphold standards without targeting people unfairly." Duncan seemed taken aback. He expected to be pushed out, not offered a path to redemption. After a pause, he nodded, avoiding Raymond's gaze. "I'll try," he said, albeit grudgingly. Word of Duncan's decision to stay and attempt change spread around the office. Some who had followed him felt betrayed. Others felt relieved. Raymond hoped that if even Duncan could be swayed, it meant there was hope for a better culture overall. Eventually, training and new policies began to feel normal rather than forced. The staff who refused to adapt either found themselves phased out or voluntarily resigned. Meanwhile, the airline reaped the benefits of happier customers, more positive media coverage, and even forged a few new international partnerships. In a moment of reflection, Raymond remembered his own journey. From being accused of theft on a flight to leading the entire airline with a mandate for change. He recalled the uneasy feeling when Duncan searched his bag, the sting of false accusation, and the realization that so many others endured the same or worse. Now, he saw the fruits of perseverance, an organization that was beginning to embody the values of equality and honesty. There were still challenges ahead, but each day, Orion Air inched closer to the airline he had envisioned, one where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of appearance or background. Sitting in his office, he thought about his grandmother's words. "People can hide their prejudices behind smiles, but with enough light shone on the issue, those prejudices are forced into the open. Only then can real change begin." He felt content knowing that he had shone that light on Orion Air, and even if the journey was far from over, the transformation had taken root. He walked into the hallway, noticing the bustle of employees. Anita passed by, giving him a quick thumbs up, and Salma waved, a stack of folders in her arms. He nodded back, a quiet pride welling up inside him. His phone buzzed, a call from a prominent civil rights organization wanting to commend him for the airline's reforms. As he took the call, he glanced around at the office walls displaying Orion Air's guiding principles. In that moment, he felt gratitude and purpose. He realized that the best way to repay the faith the board had placed in him and to honor all those who had been wronged was to continue forging ahead, ensuring no one else would ever be accused or mistreated simply because of the color of their skin. He hung up the call and strode toward the window, gazing at the horizon. The planes on the runway, shining in the midday sun, symbolized possibilities. With the right leadership and collective will, Orion Air could be a beacon of progress in an industry too often mired in outdated biases. As the new CEO, Raymond pledged to himself and to everyone watching from wherever they are around the globe that this was only the beginning. He would lead by example, proving that compassion and fairness weren't just ideals, but tangible assets that could elevate the entire airline to soar higher than ever before. Did you enjoy this story of ambition, courage, and the power of one voice to spark change? Let us know in the comments. What part resonated with you the most, or which character's journey surprised you? We love hearing your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, full of twists, heart, and inspiration, make sure to hit that subscribe button.